Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the channel. Today we're going to be talking about The Boogeyman, directed by Rob Savage. And of course this is yet another Stephen King adaptation of a short story this time around. So we are going to be getting into full spoilers for The Boogeyman. So if you have not seen this movie just yet, go check it out if you are interested. I think this movie has some merit. I don't think it's the worst horror movie in the world because I don't think that there's any horror movies, at least in recent years, that really don't try anymore. This movie does try. I think it does have some thematic elements and some reason to exist other than, just trying to get some money out of yet another Stephen King adaptation, so there are definitely some merits in this film. So what is this film about? Well, it mainly follows Sophie Thatcher's character, who is the daughter in this movie, along with her sister and her father, who is a therapist, and they had just lost their mother, who died in a car accident prior to the events of this film, and so it's going to be dealing with their grief in this process, along with, this boogeyman that's kind of haunting them inside of this house. You don't know if this creature or monster thing is really hiding underneath the daughter's bed, or if it's all in their imaginations because of their struggling collective grief of losing their own, family member. That is really what kept me interested in this movie, is this family dynamic between these three characters that really did hold this movie together, because I think all the performances in this movie are pretty solid. And I think the biggest standout probably is going to be Sophie Thatcher as the main character of this film, or I guess I feel like everybody in this family has a pretty even ground, but she has the most screen time in it. But her grief with her mother and losing her, and how she's, dealing with another school year and having these kids, all stare at her at the beginning of the movie, and she doesn't really know how to react to these things. She wants to keep all of her mother's stuff. She doesn't want to get rid of any of these things, whereas the father does not want to see any of this stuff anymore. He's kind of closed off. He doesn't want to talk about it, and he's a therapist of all things, and so it's kind of like a Who Watches the Watchmen type situation, where who does the therapist talk to? If he is the one who everybody kind of consults for this advice, he's not going to follow his own advice because he is hypocritical in his own nature, because again, he is a therapist, and I feel like that's how a lot of therapists can be if they're not healthy and do not listen to themselves. And of course, young Princess Leia is going to be scared of the dark. She's worried about the monsters in her closet, the monsters under her bed, and so the fears and the boogeyman that is in this movie kind of builds off of this, collective grief between all three of these characters. And of course, we're going to have some doubts with the father, because he is a therapist, not believing what his daughters are seeing with this monster around the corner hiding in the dark, because, he thinks it's all psychological, because again, he is a therapist. I think of all movies that try to have a type of storyline where the father doesn't believe all the haunting situations that are going on in the movie, I think this one handles it pretty well because of his, job position, because of his grief, because of him trying to put answers to everything in terms of a psychological element. And I think the psychological element of, trying to figure out what is real and what isn't when it comes to this creature, if it is just their grief and their trauma, what is actually happening in this place. I think the first half of this movie does build that suspense and that tension of, trying to figure out what exactly is going on in a pretty decent way. But really the inciting incident of this entire storyline is David Dastmalchian's character, who I love David Dastmalchian in anything that he is in. I love when he pops up in random little roles like this, and he doesn't have too much screen time, but he definitely makes an impression of, essentially bringing this boogeyman to this house. He has been haunted by this before. I think it kind of stems off of his son dying, in an accidental way with some sort of illness. I don't really exactly remember the specific reasons of why his kid died, but after that, his other two children were killed in the process, and the police kind of blame him for doing it. They think that he's on the run for doing these things, and as he's explaining everything to the therapist, he thinks that this shadow is following him, that he thinks this is the thing to blame, and he ends up wandering through the house. The daughter ended up coming home from school because of some really annoying bullying teenagers, which I'll get into them in a second here, but he ends up hanging himself in the mother's office closet, and so this brings a lot more trauma to this situation, and this is when they start seeing this shadowy creature lurking inside of the house, haunting them and kind of being a representation of that grief that they all feel. The suspense built in the first half of the movie when it comes to the more psychological things, I think work pretty well. In terms of specific sequences, you see a lot in the trailer, but the one where the little girl has the little moon lights ball, she rolls it under the bed, and you have some great sequences using this toy. I also really like the TV scene with Sawyer, having the TV playing the video game and shooting the arrow to illuminate the room to try to find out where the boogeyman is, and it all culminates into her being thrown into the television. I really did like that sequence, but I think the build up to that scene had a little bit of a missed opportunity, because, it all stems off of, SADIE's character bringing in a bunch of her friends from school to hang out at her house, and this part feels a little bit more cliched in terms of, like, it's a teenage horror movie, movie, you're going to have all these teenagers, do their thing. It kind of cuts in a weird way where, she opens the door, sees all the friends, they start screaming and like being all happy and laughing, and there's loud music, and then it cuts to them being really bored in the house because Sadie's still really traumatized by everything that has happened to her, and she doesn't know how to socialize at this point. But her friend group, let me just say, are just the worst people ever, especially that one girl who's just unnecessarily cruel to her, especially once her dress is ruined, or her mom's dress is ruined, and she kind of laughs at that fact, and it's just like, she's the worst person ever. Why would in the world would she ever want to reconcile this relationship and try to invite her to your house? That was just a bad idea to begin with. But after Sadie is locked in her mom's closet and everything happens in there, she has a panic attack and she freaks out because the creature's lurking in those shadows, and they say that the door was locked, they couldn't open the door, and they were freaking out also on the other side apparently, but I don't believe them for a second. They just needed to leave that house. But once Sadie and her father starts, talking, they encounter, and she's trying to explain what happened, and I think there was a moment there where you could have intercut her explaining what she saw with what was happening with Sawyer in the TV in the living room at the same time, because we don't really get to see that conversation play out, and I wish we got to see that conversation play out, because I think that was needed for the character development, especially the relationship between the father and these kids, to try to have her explain what's going on while we see the other daughter in danger of the very same thing that she is trying to warn her father about. And I think that is a slight missed opportunity. And there's a few points in this movie where it felt like, we're just trying to get to the next scare sequence rather than trying to build to it naturally. And I think that is my problem with this movie in terms of the horror, because I don't think this movie is necessarily scary. You don't really get to see the creature too much, and I'm not necessarily saying that you need to see the creature more in order for the movie to be scary. I think the suspense and the building of that tension was pretty decent for the first half, although it never felt as natural as something like Smile did, which I don't necessarily love the Smile movie in terms of its lack of originality, but it was genuinely really creepy. It was very well made, in terms of the directing, in terms of the suspense that was built in that film, and even though it had some, horror tropes that you've seen a lot in movies like The Ring or The Grudge or things like that, it still held its own because of how genuinely creepy the directing was. And I do think that director Rob Savage, who directed The Incredible Host a few years ago, does a good job directing this movie, especially with the cinematography and the camera movements. It was all great. I just couldn't help but to feel like I wanted a little bit more from these scares in this movie. And unfortunately, by the third act of this movie, it kind of devolves more into a monster movie than the psychological thriller that was set up in the first, 2/3 of the movie. And so I wasn't really the biggest fan of that idea, because again, I like the psychological stuff more than the monster movie stuff, and I just think that that was yet another missed opportunity for this movie. And I don't really know what the actual, short story was by Stephen King, if it was like a monster that you physically had a fight to get rid of, but I like the idea more that it's not a creature that you can physically kill, because when it comes to David Dastmalchian's wife and her trying to shoot and kill a thing with a shotgun in that entire sequence, which I thought it didn't really make sense to me, because she thought she killed it and then it just goes and it kills her instead. And it's like, I didn't see this creature as something that you need to fight physically, but something that you need to fight mentally. And by the end of the movie, you have our family fighting physically, trying to burn this thing to death, or trying to run away through all the hallways inside of their home, and it's kind of dragging them and throwing them across the room. And I feel like there was an idea of trying to kill this thing more psychologically and more mentally than it was physically, instead of just lighting it on fire and letting it burn, rather than like, the whole room that they burn it in is her mom's room. And so all her paintings, all her memories, all her clothes light up on fire. And I think that is more so what is killing the creature, rather than them, pushing the creature into the fire first, and then the creature burning, and then everything else around it burning, and you have the daughter, or you have Sadie's character be like, okay, now I can finally let go, I can move on from my mother's death, and I can, try to do something with my life after this point. I can try to live without this. And I think the idea is still there. I think those character arcs are still maintained, even though it is more of like a physical fight with these creatures rather than something more mental. And I think what makes me really think that that was the true intention of this ending was by the very end, once they're all talking to the therapist, all the families together, and Sadie goes back one last time because she thinks the therapist calls out to her, and she sees the closet door is open, and she sees the darkness lurking behind that door, and she decides not to open it this time around. She decides to shut it instead of opening that back up, opening up that grief and that pain once again, but rather, closing it off and saying, okay, I'm done with that part of me. And I think that thematically, that ending does work for this character, and it does show that growth of what she has become by the ending of this journey. I just don't think that the ending physically, the fight against this creature, reflected that as well as I think the filmmakers were trying to reflect it as. But like I said, overall, I think this is a fine movie for a PG-13 horror movie. I think that some younger audiences are going to really enjoy this thing. I think that if you're a more like light-hearted horror fan, you're not the hardcore like watching Hereditary or something like that. If you're more so going into this movie looking for some, I guess, some light thrills, I think this is a good option for you because, like I said, it does have substance. Horror movies these days don't just kind of, cheaply produce horror movies that don't have any substance whatsoever and are just trying to draw in teenagers to spend as much money as possible at the box office to try to make some sort of return. This movie's actually trying to do something about grief, and I think it fails in something like The Babadook really does handle that storyline very well versus this movie does it just okay, and those scares and those thrills are more so for, lighter horror fans. And so, like I said, if this is something that interests you, I think you might find some enjoyment in it. I don't think it is a waste of time. I thought it was a pretty decent horror movie, although it doesn't really live up to the potential that it really did have. So what did you guys think of The Boogeyman? Did you guys see it this weekend in theaters? Let me know in the comments down below all your thoughts of this film. And of course, if you enjoyed this review, make sure you guys subscribe to the channel to see more reviews just like this one. I had reviewed Evil Dead Rise not too long ago, and I really did love that movie in terms of horror this year, along with a couple others. So definitely check out my reviews for those. And also, Across the Spider-Verse has finally come out, and by the time you see this review, I will have seen this movie, and I will probably also have a review out for that movie right now as well. So definitely go check out that review, and just subscribe to the channel. Like I said, leave a like, comment down below, and I hope to see you all in my next one.